Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to the Interdisciplinary Collaborative Workshops Public Scholarship and Teaching Fall Series. My name is Melinda Lindquist, and I am an Associate Professor of History at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. I'm one of the ICW co-organizers, along with Ron Amanzadi and Haider Tun, and I'm excited to welcome you to our final fall workshop, Stories and Voices from Activists in Atlanta, Minneapolis, and Washington, D.C., an intergenerational dialogue. Over the past several years, faculty members and students across our 4 institutions, the University of Minnesota, Howard University, Morehouse College, and Spelman College, have been working together to create spaces for our scholars, students, and communities to be in conversation and work in solidarity. These workshops are an important space where we convene, speak across experience and expertise, cross-disciplinary, institutional, and regional boundaries, and learn together and with our larger audience. Please find all of our fall programs on our YouTube channel for future viewing, and please also visit us on our Google site. Today's workshop, Stories and Voices from Activists in Atlanta, Minneapolis, and Washington, D.C., an intergenerational dialogue, is a fitting ending to our fall series as we jump-started this work in the summer with 2 teach-ins on policing and protest inspired by the murder of George Floyd. Questions of activism have been central to all of our workshops, but today's workshop connects the student and racial justice movements of the past to the movements of the moment. 5 and 6 decades ago, Black students across the nation started and joined movements that would dismantle Jim Crow and become the inspiration of a new left, new student movements, feminist movements, and anti-war protest. Black youth were frequently at the heart of these movements. Today, we find our nation similarly moved by Black youth activists demanding old and new rights and protections and looking to create and envision a more democratic future. This workshop brings together the student, activists, and scholarly leaders of the 60s and 70s with the scholar activists of the present to create a space that centers learning, sharing, exchange, and empowerment. While this workshop is a fitting conclusion to our fall series, it is very much the brainchild of Dr. Clarissa Myrick Harris, the chair of the Humanities Division at Morehouse College and convener of the committee to commemorate the Atlanta Student Movement, which is spearheading the Atlanta Student Movement Initiative to share the stories and lessons of student activism of the 1960s with young activists fighting against social injustice today. She has been creating venues for intergenerational dialogues, and this afternoon, the ICW is excited to host such a conversation. It is my honor to introduce the moderator of today's conversation, Dr. Clarissa Myrick Harris. Dr. Myrick Harris is a professor of Africana Studies at Morehouse College. Her scholarship focuses on African American leadership and institution building, with a special focus on the tradition of Black women's activism, civil rights history, and transformational leadership in historically Black colleges and universities. And in a moment, I am going to hand this over to Dr. Myrick Harris. Before I do that, let me remind our audience that on Zoom, the chat is open. We invite you to use that space to share your thoughts and suggestions. The Q&A is also open. We have reserved the last 20 minutes for questions from the audience, but you're welcome to share these questions through the Q&A box as they arise. You're also welcome to open up the live transcript if captioning will make this program more accessible and enjoyable. As always, we hope that the bridges we're building between scholars, students, and community leaders will strengthen the work that's happening across our cities and throughout the nation around racial justice. Thank you so much for all of the work that you've been doing. And I would like to welcome our moderator, Dr. Clarissa Myrick Harris.
Thank you, Melinda. And first, just let me say what a pleasure it is to be here and to just give kudos to the ICW team for really pulling off this workshop series. I remember early conversations, just asking, well, what are we going to do? What now that everything is virtual, now that the pandemic is here among us? And so I think this has been a wonderful series, and I am excited to be here today to bring together this group of panelists to share a conversation about activism in the 1960s and 70s and activism of today and how they intersect and influence each other. First, I'll introduce our panelists here in Atlanta. We have Charles Black, the chair of the advisory board of Freedom University and a veteran actor, by the way. Charles is a native of Miami, Florida, and an alumnus of Morehouse College, where he was a member of the varsity debate team, editor of the college newspaper, president of the senior class, and chairman of the Atlanta Student Movement, which actually celebrates its 60th anniversary this year. Charles was one of only 8 students taught by Martin Luther King Jr. at Morehouse. Next, we have our student activist from Morehouse, Olamide Fagbamiye, a junior sociology major and public health minor at Morehouse College. He is from Douglasville, Georgia, by way of Nigeria. He's an honor student who serves as an executive board member of the Morehouse Student Government Association, and he plans to work in public health as a health administrator and advocate. He dreams of eliminating the disparities that are seen in the lack of access to quality health care for minority groups and impoverished communities. In Minneapolis, we have our student activist, Samiet Ajibola, a dedicated and passionate third-year student at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Samiet serves as the vice president of the Black Student Union, and she strives for the inclusion and celebration of Black students on her campus. She works in the Minnesota Student Association and speaks on behalf of students to administration and the media. Along with her fellow board members, Abijola Samiet has raised over $30,000 for the Black Minneapolis community. At 19 years old, Samiet has established herself as an innovative leader, and she's happiest when advocating for her community and demanding accountability from those in power. Next, we have Dr. Horace Huntley. Dr. Huntley is a retired professor from the University of Alabama, Birmingham, in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Dr. Huntley has worked extensively as a historian in the fields of civil rights, labor history, Black history, and African American history. He was the inaugural director of the Oral History Project of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And while a student at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in the 1960s, Dr. Huntley participated in demonstrations by Black students demanding Black studies at the university. He co-authored the book, Nerve Juice and the Ivory Tower, Confrontations in Minnesota, the true story of the Morrell Hall takeover. Next, we have Dr. August Nymphs, who came of age in the Jim Crow era in New Orleans. He was politically forged by the Freedom Now, or the Civil Rights Movement, Black nationalism, the Cuban Revolution, and the other Third World revolutionary upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s. He is professor of political science and African American and African studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and member of the Academy of Distinguished Teachers at the University of Minnesota. Among his recent articles is Why There Are No George Floyds in Cuba. His most recent book is Marxism versus Liberalism, Comparative Real-Time Political Analysis. He helped to organize actually what was probably the first anti-apartheid protest at an HBCU in May of 1964 in Washington, D.C. as a student at Howard University at that time. He and other students formed a picket line in front of the White House to protest the jailing of Mandela. In DC, we have Dr. Ruby Gordine, a member of the School of Social Work on the faculty at Howard University. Dr. Gordine has worked as a clinical administrator, consultant, and researcher in the areas of juvenile justice, foster care, and adoption, medical social work, school social work, and most recently in social work history. Her publications include referee journal articles and book chapters on topics such as child welfare, teenage pregnancy, transracial adoption, and many others. She is the co-author of the book Social Action, Advocacy, and Agents of Change, which came out a few years ago, and it is about the Howard University School of Social Work in the 1970s. First, we want, and I just want to make sure everyone's, all cameras are on now. Good to see all of your faces. I want to start by first having you each share your personal stories. How were you called to activism, and how has your activism evolved over time? Charles, we'll begin with you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I should note that the generation followed what Tom Brokaw called the Great Generation. So that our forebears went overseas to fight enemies to make the world safe for democracy. But those who were Black were discriminated against while they were in the service. When they came home, they were still called niggers. People were also hanged, some in their uniforms. So as Dr. Mays would say in his book, Born to Rebel, we were born to rebel. We were aware of the experiences of our parents, and of course of the historical slavery and discrimination that our ancestors had endured. So that when we had a challenge and an opportunity to make what we considered revolutionary change, we were ready. We were spurred by the actions of the 4 students in Greensboro, North Carolina, with an idea whose time had come. We saw that this was a way to get the attention of the community and of the world and make some change. Our forebears in the Atlanta University Center and in the broader community felt that we should continue to allow the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to fight these battles rather than doing this direct action thing. And of course, they were concerned about our well-being and about their responsibility to our parents who had sent us to school to learn, not to go to jail. When they were convinced that we were going to proceed with the direct action, one of the presidents suggested that we should at least tell the community why we were doing what we were doing. And that led to the publication of a document called An Appeal for Human Rights that was published as a full-page ad in the local newspapers. Was picked up by the New York Times for free, and a newspaper in LA, was read into the congressional record by Senator Jacob Javits of New York. That document is available online, An Appeal for Human Rights. And with that notice to the community, 1 week later, we began sit-in protests at 11 institutions in Atlanta. These included places of public assembly, governmental, city hall, county, and state government, as well as department stores like Rich's Department Store, Davidson's, and the 5 and dime stores like Woolworths, Kretzky's, and the like. We had our demonstrations on March the 15th at 11 o'clock at 11 locations. And they were planned with military precision. So we knew how many doors there were to enter the facilities, how many seats there were, and we knew where the phone booths were, where we could have a watcher standing by to report any signs of trouble. Many of us were arrested on that day. I was arrested at the terminal train station, along with Martin Luther King Jr.'s brother, A.D. Williams King, and a lot of other students. And that began our activism as students here in Atlanta.
Thank you, Charles. And when we circle back around, I also want you to talk about that incident that occurred that propelled the Atlanta student movement into the national headlines 60 years ago during a presidential election, but we'll save that for later.
Okay.
Samyet? Olamide. Forgive me. I'm sorry, Samia. We're still in Atlanta. Olamide, you're next.
All right, thank you for that question. For me, what got me into activism, of course, is just recognizing the history of where I am. I like as stated, I am a current Morehouse College student, and understanding the history that comes with it. For example, having Mr. Black on the call right now, you understand like many individuals have come before me, and they're fighting for the same purpose that we're fighting for today, and we're living in the same experiences they are. They say times have changed, but in reality, nothing really has. It just looks a lot differently. Um, so I say for me, a lot of the activism comes from being able to just share a message through social media and through word of mouth, and through encouragement of just understanding like eventually things will work out for the betterment. Because I'm a very hard believer in faith. But beyond that, I also realize that faith without works is dead. So the works part comes from realizing where you can step in, and that comes from looking at the career field that you're aspiring to be in, and how can you help the same person that looks just like you and struggling in the same sense that you're trying to provide a service for. That's one of the bigger reasons why I want to go into public health and health policy and management, and really just work towards bettering healthcare, understanding like even how oppression and things of what we're going through right now are not just in the U.S. but worldwide. Things back in Nigeria with SARS and just the whole general government, I recognize like you have to be able to be a world citizen, and I think many of our beloved leaders from the past would say the same thing. Um, and in knowing that, I realize that my activism has grown throughout this whole year actually, where it's more of wanting to get things done and being out there. um I attended my first protest actually maybe I think 3 weeks or 4 weeks or so ago, because during the summer, I'm still a college student at the house due to COVID. My parents were just like, maybe you should just stay inside. But it got to a point where they understood a lot more, and were understanding like, it's okay to be able to step out and do more actions. I mean, it's beyond that. It's just realizing there's so much more to do, and the availability to do it is there. So
Right.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Samia, and I'm happy to see, just like Olamide, I'm also Nigerian American, and I'm also majoring in sociology with a minor in public health. Um, I first want to say how honored I am to be a panelist here today, and also just to be in the presence of so many amazing activists. Specifically, I'd like to say I'm honored to be in the presence of Horace Huntley, because without him, I probably wouldn't have half the opportunities I do at my campus, and the Black Student Union that I'm so passionate about wouldn't have even been here. So I do want to thank you for all that you've done, and I truly honor you. Um, I've basically started my journey in activism when I was a part of a living learning community called Charlottetown. It's a community for Black women on campus who live and learn together throughout their first year of college. And it was named after a student activist named Charlotte Crump, and she was an activist in the 1930s who fought against housing discrimination. And she also went on to be the founder of the Negro Student Council and the Jack and Jill Foundation. And because of people like Ms. Crump and Dr. Huntley, that's how I kind of began my interest in activism. Going to a predominantly white institution, we're oftentimes faced with things like microaggression and tokenism, and sometimes just blatant racism. And in those times, my friends and I always thought to ourselves, well, what would Charlotte do, or what would Dr. Huntley do? And the answer to that was to march our way up to whoever was in charge and demand change. And that's exactly what we got. Of course, now those were minor things, but they started to accumulate, and they started to be something bigger than that. And then after a while, we kind of stopped asking the question of what would Charlotte do or what would Dr. Huntley do. It began saying like, what do we want to do, and what do we want our legacy on this campus to look like? So fast forwarding to the murder of George Floyd, the anger and the more of a, I would say, fear that I felt in that moment is what fueled me to begin to create change. And at that time, I was the marketing chair and public relations of the Black Student Union. So I decided to launch a social media campaign on our platform. And through that, we rallied our students to call local government and demand for the arrest. We organized community cleanups, protests, sit-ins, and raised, like said in my bio, thousands of dollars for our community. And just seeing the happiness and like the proudness that my community had in this moment, that seemed to be one of the lowest moments we've had in years, inspired me to continue this journey and to keep going a step further. And with that change, I was given the honor of becoming vice president of the Black Student Union. And with that, actually, I guess about 2 days ago now, I'm officially the president of the Black Student Union. So to me, it's more important to be appointed by God than rather by man. Of course, I'm honored to be in this position, and I'm grateful to have the platform of the Black Student Union, but I'm even more honored for the gift that I was given to be able to speak and advocate for my community and my people. And that's really my journey thus far. It's much shorter than the veterans around me, but it only has just begun, and I'm excited to see the change that I'm going to be able to make.
All right.
Well, Samuel, thank you for the accolades. You are an inspiration to those of us who came along a little bit earlier than you. In terms of my activism, I was just thinking about that question, and I remember a story that's gone through our family. I was born in the Jefferson Hillman Hospital in Birmingham, Alabama on 20th Street. Of course, at that time, the institution, all of the institutions were totally segregated. The back door was designed for Black folk to go through, and white folk went through the front door. The day on December 5th, 1942, my two grandmothers decided to send a message to Birmingham and to the world. They broke the law by going in the front door of the hospital. And I often say that when they did that, they gave me what I've been termed as nerve juice. My paternal grandmother was actually a student at Tuskegee Institute when it was a high school. My maternal grandmother was from the Black Belt, from Greene County, Alabama, never schooled. She was illiterate, totally illiterate, couldn't read nor write, but she was one of the most brilliant folk, of course, that I've ever known. I graduated from Winona High School in Birmingham in 1961, wanted to go to Tuskegee, but my mother couldn't afford to send me, so I decided to join the Air Force and see the world. And they sent me to Grand Forks, North Dakota. So that was most of the world that I saw at that time. After finishing my enlistment in the Air Force, I went to Minneapolis and started at the university in 67. At that time, I had met three people really, that would have a great impact upon my future life, my activism as well. Bill English, who was he was a social worker, he was an organizer in South Minneapolis. Mahmoud El Khati, who was a historian, originally from Florida, but had been in Minneapolis for a while, and Rosemary Freeman, who was an activist with SNCC during high school in Greenwood, Mississippi. These were the three people that had the most impact upon me in terms of activism. As I matriculated through the University of Minnesota, after the first year, I met Rose Freeman, and we became really tight friends. She was She was the kind of person, she was, being from Greenwood and I'm from Alabama, we had a very close relationship. And there's a long story behind that, but I won't get into that today. But anyway, she was the president of the African American Action Committee, AAAC. They had the year prior to, the year that Dr. King was assassinated in '68, the student organization issued a series of demands to the university, and the university had not acted upon any of them by the end of 1968. So in '69, Rose was president of the organization. I was vice president by then. And we decided to push those demands. And the way that we did it, of course, was we took over the administration building, Moore Hall, spent, I think, 24 hours there maybe. And out of that, we realized then the development of the African and African American Studies Department that is still in existence there in Minnesota. That type of activism was normal for that time because it was really the height of the civil rights and human rights struggles of the 1960s. Those kinds of things were happening all over the country, in Black institutions as well as white. We were successful. We had relationships with other organizations, and we developed a student conference where we invited people from all over the country to come, and people from California to Alabama came to our conference, and that resulted in what we were attempting to do, was to get an African American Studies department. And that department, as I said, is still in existence, and it has created an atmosphere on campus. I know for us during that period, it created a home for Black students, because that time there were 87 Black students out of a student population of over 40,000. And it became pretty obvious that we needed to come together to deal with the problems that we felt that we had, and we did. And I will sort of end there, but of course during the period I will add some other additional things to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. August?
Yes. Hi, Clarissa and everybody else.
Hi there.
I want to thank the organizers of this for inviting me to be a part of this. And one of the things I've been real conscious about over the last few years is making sure history, the lessons of the struggle, are transmitted to younger generations. And so this is a great opportunity for us to be able to do that. When the George Floyd murder happened, and as soon as I heard about it and heard that there was going to be a protest, I knew I had to attend. And so I had the honor and privilege of attending the first George Floyd protest, and that took place on Tuesday at 5 o'clock on May 26th. And as a 77-year-old African-American male, I had to be very conscious about attending that demonstration. The mayor had suggested that we could hold the action, but we had to socially distance and have our mask on. And so most of us had masks on, but we really couldn't socially distance. Everybody wanted to be in the space where George Floyd was murdered. And to the surprise of all of us, 5,000 people showed up of a very, very multiracial. I was actually say that the majority of the participants were Caucasians. And that's an important, fact about what happened here in the Twin Cities that I'll come back and talk about later. That decision on my part to attend the event was the product of the kind of history that Horace has talked about and Charles has talked about. I had the privilege, good luck, to be born into a very political family. Both my parents were active in the civil rights movement in Jim Crow, New Orleans and elsewhere. Both of them were presidents of their unions, their trade unions, in which they were members. And so the first action I was involved in, I really didn't know about it, but that's the way the movement is. And so my mother and other teachers helped to organize a boycott of a racially segregated Jim Crow event that school children had to participate in New Orleans. And that took place 2 weeks before the historic Supreme Court decision. And it was on May 1st, 1954. And 2 weeks later, the Supreme Court ruled in the famous Brown versus Board of Education. So I was a part of the movement. Before then, something I'm very proud of. Didn't think about it really until some years later. My household was also very conscious about international development. So when Ghana got its independence in 1957, my mother helped my sister and I to organize an event at our high school about the history of Ghana, what had happened in Ghana. And so that was also a part of my development. And probably because New Orleans is a port city, we're very conscious about developments happening elsewhere in the world. So 2 years later, when the Cuban Revolution happened, that had a real big impact on me, especially learning about how the revolution immediately broke down all of the Jim Crow features that were in place within Cuba. And as soon as I heard about that, I was forever won to the Cuban Revolution. And I continued to be an activist in defense of the Cuban Revolution and extending solidarity to the Cubans. Fast forward later in 1964, when I was a graduate student in African Studies at Howard University, a group of us decided to organize a protest when we heard and learned about Nelson Mandela and others who were on trial in the spring of 1964. We did it at the White House. We organized a picket line. We didn't have any details. We didn't have the evidence. We knew somehow Washington was involved in his arrest and in the trial. And we learned out later that was indeed the case. The CIA had been following Mandela throughout Africa, and that evidence was supplied by the CIA to the South African government. That was the basis for his trial. And so the international side of my activism goes way back. And for the next 20, 25 years, between 1976, 1977, I was actively involved in the anti-apartheid movement here in Minnesota and elsewhere, and helped to celebrate, was part of the celebrations when Mandela was released from prison in February 1990. So yes, internationalism for me is very much a part of my activism. And so I'm very thrilled to learn about the impact that the protests around George Floyd have had within Africa, not only in Nigeria, but also as a former student of mine was telling me the other day from Sierra Leone, the impact that the George Floyd protests have had within Sierra Leone. And so that is of major significance, and that we shouldn't take it for granted. And just lastly, I want to thank fellow panelist Ruby for bringing to my attention the history of organizing on the Howard campus and learning that perhaps I was a part of one of the first actions at a historic Black college university in the anti-apartheid movement. So thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you, August. Ruby.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to thank all of the organizers for this. Has been a wonderful experience. I am very impressed with having had the opportunity to meet so many people who dedicated themselves to protests in terms of trying to improve the opportunities for Blacks and others in the United States. And it's very important. And as you go through life, you're never too old to learn, and you are never too old to be impressed with the amount of energy and impact that you've had on society. So I thank all of you for your contributions. One of the questions that came up is, how do you get involved with activism? And I think it comes for me, from my family. Well, nobody asks me, say, well, you go out and march and do any of those activities. But when I saw my members of the family reading the paper every day, and we would get two, one in the morning, one in the evening, they would go through that religiously and make comments about issues that appeared in the paper. And so we soak up what we hear. And so as a result of that, I always was curious about what was happening in society. And as early as 12 years old, I decided I would contribute professionally as a social worker, and I did become a social worker because I was very concerned about what was happening in the community. I had the opportunity to grow up in several states, but I finished high school in Richmond, Virginia, which is a state that was very segregated. And I went to a segregated high school, even though the 54 decision had called for desegregation. We were told we could go to other schools, but we decided we would stay at our segregated school because we were doing so well. And we were being so supported. And we said, why give it up? Others were strong enough and brave enough to do that. But we think when I graduated, we had the largest number of students going to college out of that high school. And so I think having that support helped people, help me, let me talk about myself, develop ideas about what society could be. Now, one of the things that segregation did, and I think this was a byproduct that people didn't think about, is that while we lived in segregated neighborhoods and communities, they were so strong and supportive. You couldn't, I think about at a class reunion recently, a group of us got together. It was about 7 of us. We lived within the same 2 blocks. All of us went to school together, and most of us went to Howard. And you think about that, and they talk about these neighborhoods. How can you get 7 young people going to the same high school and college at the same time within a 2-block radius? That's what segregation did. And so we got a underlining message about who we were and what we could be. And so I think that begins to develop your thinking, because you hear a lot of negative about Black communities. The other thing that you saw was when the city was segregated, when they were demanded that people were supposed to integrate. We had these, the theaters were downtown, the bigger ones. And so what they did is they closed them down so nobody could attend. And so that was their answer. And if you're familiar with Virginia history, they closed down the school system in Prince Edward County for over 5 years so people didn't have to integrate. That was the message we were receiving from the wider community. And then we had to interpret that in terms of what we wanted to do professionally. So fast forward, I ended up going to Howard as an undergrad. It was there that I saw activism really come to fruition. It's not that I didn't see it on TV, as we watch, I grew up in an era where you had the one TV and everybody watched it together, so you had the same conversation, unlike what happens today. And actually that's powerful because you are interacting with your parents and cousins and other people who are watching the same story and seeing the same. And so you get to talk about it in a different way than if you're watching it differently. And so I make a plug for that. But anyway, I arrived at Howard as a wide-eyed freshman, and there was so much going on at Howard in terms of student activism. And so how I got involved was during the 68 student takeover of the administration building. And I call myself as a follower. I don't call myself as a leader. I had to manage the expectations of my parents as well as I'm sorry, as well as my colleagues on campus. And so that was difficult because I had a great aunt who called up daily and said, don't get in that Howard mess. And I'm checking on you. So I told the story of how I would march in front of Douglas Hall and we had our little signs of protest, but I also made sure that I was behind my sign so my face wouldn't show. And I worked part-time at the federal government and we were told we couldn't protest or we would lose our jobs. And so my supervisor said she thought she recognized my legs on a picture that appeared in the Washington Post. And when she asked me, I just looked at her incredulously. And so what she didn't know is how strong the Howard bond was, because the rest of the students who worked in that unit were from Howard and also from Richmond. Remember my group? They said, are those Ruby's legs? And everybody said, no, why would she be in that picture? And so as it turns out, I didn't tell a lie. I didn't say what I was, but it were my legs. They were my legs. And so I was trying to manage that. And I often tell the story that two of my very best friends who worked with us down there and went to Howard had also told their parents that they weren't participating. And they did go into the building and they were sleeping in there in the takeover. But when the Ebony came out the next month, they had a picture of students standing in front and center with my two friends. And they got all kinds of calls from home because they had already told their parents they weren't participating. And I say that because I think people, and I think Mr. Black talked about this in terms of families were very afraid of you being hurt. They were very afraid of you missing out on the education. And so they were trying to be protective. And I think in some ways, students were trying to be protected as well. And that doesn't say we didn't have students up front and out front, but people were trying to manage their expectations within their family context. And I think that speaks a lot for how we get involved. But one of the things that Howard taught me, and I'm not saying we got it all right at the same time, is that this protest that happened in '68 started way before then. There were a number of issues that Harvard students had complaints about. One was, some of them seemed very simple. It's like not hiring people to build a new gym that were people of color and protesting that. Going down to Congress to protest how Adam Clayton Powell was being treated during his hearings, or looking in the community and seeing things that weren't right. But they also focused on two major issues, and one was the Vietnam draft. And for people who are too young to know about, they used to draft people into service, and they would literally come on campus and remove them. We have actually seen the people come on campus and drag Black men off the campus to go into service. And so they had invited General Hershey, who was in charge of selective service there, to the campus. We had this mandated assembly we had to attend. And so he was speaking, and I can't remember what the speech was, but I'm sure it wasn't exciting. And all of a sudden, about 200 students rushed from the back and pelted him with rotten tomatoes. Well, you know, the school was embarrassed because immediately they said the Howard students were out of control and they wanted to suspend them. And they did suspend the people they could identify. However, what Howard didn't have at that point is a judicial system to hear the complaints. And so since then, Howard has a judicial system on which students So something came out of that. The other issue that came, that got crystallized was the development of African American programs. And while Howard always had a stellar reputation, people felt that it mirrored too much the European model. And so the students really wanted more cultural content discussed. And I have to say that I got to read, and I remember reading Man-Child in the Promised Land, and a number of, the list is way too long to even go through. And it gives you a different perspective than when you're only reading mainstream literature. And so the protest not only was a way to change systems, it was a way of changing you. It was internalized in how you begin to see the world. And so I think we may have a question later, but that's how I think in the long run you can stay in the movement, because you move from what's important at that particular time in the community to what is important today. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And that also ties into the next question that I'll throw out for responses from the panel. You each have talked about how you entered activism. For some, you were born into it. Your families brought you into it. For others, your activism started once you went to school, to college, or it was sparked by something that occurred in your community. And then the expression of your activism is, there's commonalities, but there are also differences. I think often people think of activism as only being on the front lines, picket sign, demonstrating, sit-ins. But what you have said, each of you, the veterans as well as the current student activists, but each of you says that there are many paths to activism. So I'd appreciate some discussion about the different ways that people contributed to the movement in the 60s, okay? 60s, 70s. Not everyone was on the front line. You've talked about your own experiences, but Charles tells a story about some of the ways that students in the AU Center contributed other than being on the front lines because of the friction that being on the front lines would cause with family members. So can you speak to those different paths to activism? That's one part of the question. And then the other part, and you've each spoken to this to some extent, how is it that our colleges and universities have become centers of social change, especially during the period of the civil rights movement, but on to today? This is something, and actually, we can go farther than that. There was a book called The New Negro on Campus that talked about student activism on historically Black colleges in the 1920s. But just your insights on how it is that these institutions spark this activism. But first, those different paths and different ways of expression of activism. If you could speak more to that. Charles?
Yes, I always remind people that a movement is by its nature multidimensional, which means that it involves a deep commitment to lofty principles on the part of a lot of people doing a lot of different things over a long period of time. And the essence of all that is that you cannot expect everybody to do all the same things. Some people are willing to walk picket lines or to sit in, to go to jail and all of that, but others are not, but they want to be supportive. So in the case of Atlanta, we had people who would make sandwiches for us, adults in the community, provide transportation for us, help with making of signs, and all that sort of thing. But also, at our request, folks sent us their department store credit cards as they closed their accounts with these department stores. But the biggest thing was that many people put their homes on the line to bail us out of jail. And these were not people that we knew individually, and they didn't know us individually. I have no idea to this day who bailed me out of jail. But our movement had that kind of moral suasion in the community that people wanted to do all of these different things. And if you are leading a movement, you have to be prepared to accept whatever contribution is being offered by whomever, however small you may consider that to be. I think that's the essence of movement success.
Yes, yes, indeed. Horace, you have anything to add to this?
Yes, I do. I had the privilege to interview quite a few people who were actively involved in the civil rights movement in Birmingham. And as Charles has stated, there were all kinds of methods that people brought to the movement. Um, you talk about bringing sandwiches. There were people that would actually cook for those who were actively involved. There were um, women. Oh well, I'll say older at that time. They were in their 30s probably, who would get together and develop carpools and take people from various places around the city. Um, there were people who would, as you mentioned earlier, who made signs, who actually went out to write up things that they would take to the newspapers. We had one black newspaper in Birmingham at the time, and I think they had one person that worked on the newspaper. So they would obviously like to have others who would assist with that. But all of these things are vitally important when you're talking about a struggle, a movement, because without any of those, you come up lacking. Uh, there were always, of course, those who would demonstrate. Uh, that's what we usually call the activists. But I think that other people came in other doors of activism that were just as important as those who were struggling on the streets.
Yes, indeed. Anyone else want to add to that? Well, I'll
Yeah,
move on to, I'm sorry, go ahead, August.
well, I was just thinking, there's an aspect of activism sometimes I think we take for granted. I know I did when I was in many a struggle I was involved in, and I've become more conscious about it. And that is the importance of documenting the struggles while you're a part of them. If you don't tell your own history, other people will tell it for you.
Exactly.
And so I recommend to young people today, don't take for granted at all the kinds of efforts that you're involved in. You got to document it. That's the only way in which movements can advance. We learn from struggles, and so some of us have been able to do that in our later years. Horace's great book about what happened here at the University of Minnesota. But in the moment, though, in real time, it's important that there be people there who are actually helping to document what actually takes place in the struggle.
Yes, and that is a form of activism, to be sure, in it of itself.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. I think that what happens is that it keeps changing because I think society changes. One of the things that happened to me after graduating from Howard is I went back to Richmond and worked in a segregated job at juvenile court. And there I met Doug Wilder, who later became the first governor of Virginia. But I worked in his first campaign when he was running for state senator. And I got the political bug in that, not becoming a person who wanted to run themselves, but I worked in his campaign. When I moved to DC years later, well, let me kind of get it in order. I ended up going to graduate school at Atlanta and worked in Maynard Jackson's campaign, urged by our professors. And when I came to DC, I worked in Marion Barry's campaign, was on his transition team. So I think you turn some of you, I think somebody mentioned that you're not always in the street, but what you're doing is you're participating in places where change has to happen. And those were moments and points in time where change was very much necessary. And to be a part of that, to me, was energizing. It was personally rewarding. And so it kept my juices going so I could continue to do that. And so I think up until recently, I worked at the polls every year for voting. because I kept that up. And I had, you know, people I knew personally who ran for office, always supporting them. So I think people change in that aspect of how you do that. And I want to mention that I had the wonderful experience of working with Joyce and Dory Ladner. Joyce Ladner was my dissertation chair for my degree. And so I feel that I have been fortunate to have had these opportunities. And so I'm trying to give those back to the students that I work with and pass it forward.
Excellent, excellent. I I mentioned a discussion perhaps around how universities and colleges have become centers of social activism, but I think you have expressed that as you talked about your own personal experiences. And that is something that is a pattern in our history, protests being sparked by students, faculty on various campuses, HBCUs, PWIs, and so on. I think something that is that is especially noteworthy about what's going on today is that the protests are being led, the protests are being done, participated in by people across the spectrum. Charles mentioned earlier, was it August, I think, about the diversity of the protesters in the wake of the George Floyd murder. White, Black, Latino, various socioeconomic levels, students, working class people, middle class folk. How do the protests that were sparked by the murder of George Floyd connect to a larger structure and larger structures of systemic racism and inequality? And how have these current struggles, protests, started to perhaps shape or reshape your own insights and your own forms of activism and viewpoints about activism? Anyone want to take that on? I'll let's say, Horace, you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a very important piece, a very important question about and in comparing what was then and what is now. That's one of the obvious things, is that there are more people who are involved now. What that says to me is that the same issues, the same type of issues that we have here in this country and that people have in other countries are very similar. Now it's just a matter of combining those efforts. I think I made a statement that Birmingham was a local issue. Atlanta was local, and it would become regional, and then it would become national. Now that George Floyd has happened and all of the others' lives have been lost, they have extended that from the national borders to an international border. And as someone earlier mentioned here, George Floyd now is known all over the world. You can hear his name in Minneapolis, in Atlanta, in Birmingham, but also in Saigon, in Johannesburg. So this movement is a movement that is expanded to the extent that it will impact the world. Although I think that the things that were happening earlier impacted the world, but not as the way that it has the potential of that impact. Now we have students here from Nigeria, from all over the continent, from everywhere, and they will be able to take whatever back home, or if they're not going back, whatever, they will have a very close relationship with people who are local and people who are international, based upon the types of struggles that are happening, and all of us are being touched by them.
Yes,
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things in terms of structures and institutions about the George Floyd protest, the fact that there's an echo of them in Nigeria and Sierra Leone makes it very clear it's not just a racial issue, it's about the police. It's the reality, the reality of the police. And this has been very, very instructive. Yeah, the international dimension, because you remember the civil rights movement, by the way, we didn't really call it that. The historians gave that name. We were much more likely to call it the Freedom Now movement. But it was impacted by developments in India, the African independence. I know in my own household, the impact of the African independence struggle had a big impact, as I say, that my own case with the Cuban Revolution. So it's fascinating now to see how the George Floyd protests are having international dimensions. And one of the things I'm very conscious about is making clear to young people that sometimes when you're in the middle of a struggle, just as we were, sometimes you can take it for granted because you're in the middle of it and you don't see the broader significance of what you're actually doing. And sometimes it was only in later years that I began to recognize the significance of the things I had been involved in. So I'm very conscious now about trying to impart to young people not to take for granted the movements that they're involved in, to look at them in historical perspective, because sometimes you'll hear young people say, well, nothing has really changed. Well, I don't know. Some of us can talk about the old days. We'll tell you what it was like before the Freedom Now movement in the United States. So to help give them historical and global perspective. Historical and global perspective.
Yes. I'd like to hear from our student activist on this topic, Olamide, in terms of what's happening in wake of the George Floyd murder, the protest, the magnitude, the international aspect, and your own personal history, family history. How does that, your history, your personal history, impact your activism in light of what's going on now, and vice versa?
Of course. So one thing that I notice now with the loss of George Floyd is that, you know, young people are becoming more and more active. Not that they weren't before, but as I mentioned, like, we recognize the shoes we must fill. Most of these initial movements were done by young people when they started. They were in college. If not in college, they were recent graduates. Like, it wasn't necessarily just relying on the elders of their lifetime to do the work that they needed to, but instead they recognize, like, I have some shoes to fill as well. So I think for a lot of us, we recognize the portion of doing our part, and then beyond that, on a global scale, everybody recognized that oppression doesn't change. You know, that I think in one of my courses we learned that what's the point of comparing oppression? Like, who got it worse? Everybody got it bad at the end of the day. So, you know, in saying that, you recognize that there's an effort to just dispel and get rid of all types of oppression across the board. And as mentioned, it looks like it's not just racism, but it goes into the deep underlying factors of what these powers were there for. So, like, what were police actually put in place for? They weren't necessarily just put just to govern us, you know, to really hold up the law, but there were other practices that were done by, you know, implementing police. So on a broad national scale, personally for my family, it definitely is something that you look at and it's like, wow, you know, back home it's very wild over there, but here it's wild as well. So, like, every day, my parents are wondering, asking me to get home on an early time schedule, because it's like, why would I, as a Black man, want to just, you know, be out when, you know, there's a likelihood of you possibly not coming home? So I'm a 20-year-old individual who has maybe like a 11:45 what's you call it,
Curfew?
curfew. Thank you. And now I'm 20 years old, and in my head I'm like, man, this is not the life I want to live. You know, a college student, this and that. But in reality, it's like they just love me enough to know that I don't want you to get caught up in situations. I was out yesterday with a friend and she asked me like, how do you feel about seeing police lights when you're driving? And the first answer I gave her is I get scared. I get fearful. Because there's been moments, the first time I actually got pulled over, I told her that the officer did his job and he was a white male. Both of them were white males, but they did their job and there was nothing crazy about the situation. But you see media, you know the history, you know, like, okay, this could really go south anytime, any moment, just because I'm reaching for my wallet to show him my ID that he asked for, you know, and in various different situations. Um, but I say all that to say that in this moment now that I still recognize that I have a job to fill, and in fear there's still courage, and there's moments and movements that are going on that I'm a part of, and I'm glad to be a part of.
Yes, thank you, thank you. Samiette, I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, so I would say very similarly that for sure when it came to George Floyd, I wanted to do something and I wanted to do something big. And that's just my personality. I was like, I have to go out there, I have to do something like now. And I wanted to go out and protest was my first instinct. And I'm looking in the chat now to make sure that my parents are in here. But they were like, absolutely not. You're not going anywhere. They were like, we forbid you because just like things like SARS that we were talking about earlier in Nigeria, like two of my father's brothers were killed by police. So he was like, no, like you're not going. But I went. But they don't need to know that. But I understand the fear and I understand what that does to parents and I understand what that does to us as individuals. But personally, like I talked about before, like I just don't want fear to paralyze us from making change. Instead using fear to fuel us to make a difference, because we can't continue to live in fear and allow the way this world is to continue because of us staying dormant. And that's just kind of like my take on it. But also, I think it's more than just marching in the streets, right? Like I said, I started off with a social media campaign because my parents wouldn't let me out and there was a pandemic and I wanted to do something, but I knew that I couldn't always be out there. So I found something that is useful right now that we all have access to at our fingertips. And I believe that I always tell my friends and the people around me in my board, like, you coming into college or going somewhere and breaking a statistic that goes against you is activism. You getting your education, you invading the systems that were meant to oppress us and recreating them into something that can help our community is a form of activism. And when it comes to George Floyd, of course, there's a lot of noise, but there's been noise before that. There's been noise for years and years and years. And like, we cannot choose to use this instance as a catalyst for like these things have already been in motion. A lot of the things with reform for the police have been in motion before George Floyd. It's just like the highlight of it is what made it progress faster. And I like to talk about how reform is not something obscure. There was reform of the police before in like the form of creating like EMT, right? And like emergency responders. Like that is police reform. It didn't used to be that way. And it's just like, so I like wanna encourage everyone to just remember that the goals that we have are not crazy goals. They really aren't. They might seem like it in the grand scheme of life and how hard we have to work to get them, but they're things that are attainable and things that personally I'm going to continue to work towards.
Yes, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, thank you. I have a question related to your personal lives. And some of you spoke a little bit to this, and in our pre-conversation discussion yesterday, you spoke more specifically. So I think people would really like to hear, given the level of your activism over your lifetime for the veterans, and given the intensity of your activism just within the space of the last year, few months for our younger activists, how do you make sure you have some balance in your life, sanity in your life? How do you disconnect? Can you disconnect at any point in time? We know that many of our veteran activists have experienced post-traumatic stress. Didn't call it that then, but that it's definitely what we would call it now. How do you make sure that you maintain your personal health and safety and sanity, even as you continue your activism. And we'll start with some of the veterans and come back to our younger activists.
I'll start because I might be obvious since I'm a social work clinician. And I've been participating at Howard. We've been doing these town halls and self-care events to help with faculty and students, because students are, along with faculty, are under a lot of stress. And this is different because I describe this time as 3 pandemics. One is the, of course, the medical one. Then we have the racial issues. Then we have the political issues. All of them are very overwhelming. And for many of us, we'll say this to ourselves: how in the world can people think all of this is okay? Because it doesn't make sense. It's not logical. And so one of the things we talk about is we talk about implementing like mindfulness, giving yourself time and space so that you can repair yourself. And so I think Charles mentioned yesterday is just moving yourself out. He had an experience where he talked about that he had to move out because of this depression and the things that affected them. I remember talking to Dr. Ladner, and she talked about her work and how when she completed her degree, how she had to move herself out. And so at points, you have to have some sense of when this is enough for you in terms of what you're currently doing. If it's activism and going in the street, when is that enough and it begins to harm you personally? You have to remove yourself. That doesn't mean that you've removed yourself from the movement. You've removed yourself from the harm of the moment. We all need to find safe spaces. And sometimes it's in a corner of your room doing yoga, or it's doing something that you really enjoy, even if it's like reading a book, or even watching a crazy TV show. What is it that gives you that sense of self beyond the problems of the world? Because those problems of the world remain regardless. And we wouldn't be having this talk if they had been solved. And so, and they move in different ways. And I think we have, for me personally, what has happened to me being in social work, which we can always see something wrong in social work, is getting involved. I was the beneficiary of the civil rights movement, where people had to start hiring Black people. They didn't hire unqualified Black people, like people used to like to say. I couldn't get hired in child welfare until I passed the test. And so if I passed the test and the other person passed the test, who's unqualified? No, that's not the criteria. But I also was the youngest and the only Black in the unit. I had to put up with a lot of stuff. That wasn't street activism, but I had to stand up. And I learned to do that despite that in times when I didn't want to do that. I had to ask the questions because it was unfair.
Yes.
And so, and I know looking around the room at who's here, the same people had to do the same things. If you went out professionally and you went to any place, you were going to be questioned. And particularly if you were kind of breaking those barriers. And so I think now with the young people, you have the same opportunity, but you have to put yourselves in the place where you can be strong. I've just had a recent talk with one of my students. You need to find allies. And those allies support you. They don't tell you what to do. And that's one of the things with the movement, with the multiculturalism. People like that because they want to know that people in society are supporting you. But they aren't supporting you if they're telling you what to do and not listening to what your ideas are and how you want to be treated and how you want things to change systemically. So it makes it easier for people of color and people who have been historically discriminated. And so what in there is, first thing, have your own model. Take care of yourself personally. Make sure you get all you need to make you a viable person. And when you do that, then you still are doing the work of the people.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I want to, since we are, gosh, we're at 3:19 and this is supposed to end at 3:30. So I want to take some questions. There's a Q&A box, but there's also a chat. And I see one of my colleagues at Morehouse has asked a question, and Sam Livingston. Hi, Sam. Scarlet activist August Nymphs, the civil rights movement, if named by grassroots community and activists, would be called the Freedom Now movement. This is powerful as it addresses the confrontation and fear that communities and activists have had to achieve regardless of historical era. What would be one lesser known episode that students of the movement today should note and draw lessons from?
Is that for me, Clarissa?
Yes, this
Yeah,
is
okay.
one. And others
Yeah.
can answer too, but starting with you, August.
Quickly, the most important thing is the power of mass movements in the streets, mass disciplined, peaceful movements in the streets. I oftentimes hear people say that the most important thing you can do is to vote. And I have to respectfully disagree. The first time I tried to vote, they wouldn't let me because of my skin color. 4 years later, I could. Why? It's because we had been in the streets. And the mass disciplined, peaceful movements, I argue that's the basis for real change.
Yes, yes, indeed. Anyone else want to address that? If not,
I think Charles, maybe
oh,
Charles,
I'm
but I don't
sorry.
think he has his mic on though.
Oh, Charles, you want to unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, sure, I thought I had. Yeah, I just want to note that somebody said a minute ago that there are different kinds of activism. There's the group activism, but there's also personal activism. And for the past month or so, I've been working with a white church about white privilege, making the point to them that you start where you are with your own friends, helping them to face up to the fact that they do have privilege and what do they do about that to make sure that privilege is extended to others. Again, I was advocating for a personal kind of activism there. But I think that the most important lesson that we learn is that these things do take a long time. Sometimes you have to have a commitment to. I lost my images here. Do you still see and hear me?
We hear you. We hear you. So please
Okay.
continue. There you are.
We could be committed to the long haul. As I said in my description of a movement, it's a lot of people doing a lot of different things over a long period of time. Our boycott of downtown Atlanta took more than a year for us to affect that. And you mentioned a minute ago the business of Martin Luther King's arrest. Let me just kind of shorten the story about that. There's a book that comes out in January that I'm holding in my hand here. This gentleman and his father wrote this book, and it's about that particular event. And what it is 9 days, the race to save Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and win the 1960 election. This was because there's a longer story involved, but I'll tell the shorter version. When King was arrested and sentenced to 4 months at the Reedsville State Prison here in Georgia, which is a very notorious prison. It was 2 weeks before the presidential election between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, and Nixon was leading by double digits. King's arrest and their publication of a document that came to be known as the Blue Bomb. This is a copy of it. It was printed on blue paper, told the story of how Kennedys had interceded to get King out of prison. And they distributed this flyer into all the major cities that had large Black populations. And Blacks voted in increasing numbers for the Democrats over and above how they'd been voting before. And it made the difference in the election to the extent that Kennedy won by less than 1 vote per precinct nationwide. So that's the story you'll be able to read all about in this guy's book. He sent me an advanced copy of. Comes out in January.
Thank
I'll
you.
stop now.
Thanks, Charles. You know,
Oh,
we are down
can I,
to
can I
six
mention
minutes.
one other thing?
Uh-huh.
Some friends of mine. I think the lady may be on this call with us. Nicole Young and a guy named Judge Lucky did a project called the Breathe Project about Floyd's murder, and a number of actors of us recited
Ah,
his exact words, in turn. And that project's supposed to be available pretty soon by a link. And I've asked her to share that link with us when she can.
thank you. Thank you. I'd like us to close out, to end with a question posed by one of our students, or one of our student activists, to our veterans. Um, Samiyat, Olamide, whichever one of you, do you have a question that you would like to ask as you continue your paths as activists?
I do have one, but I'll allow Samia to go first if she has one. You don't got one? Okay. So the question I had actually was, do you believe classism within our race has caused any disconnect and delayed our progress in our activism and receiving equity? So by that I mean like having individuals, um, like like the Beyoncés, the LeBron James, the various individuals who are in these different entertainment industries and have reached a new status in their class, and how we sometimes as the community look to them as the next leaders. And as Malcolm X had mentioned, like that's not their job. Like they're not supposed to be in that. We're not looking to them for that. But like, do you think, having classism within our race has caused disconnect and delayed our progress overall in activism and equity?
Can I speak to that?
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Please.
Definitely.
Okay. The the advent of movie stars and basketballs at the level, basketball players, those type are, we've had people speak up before, like Jackie Robinson, and of course they had nowhere near the wealth that you're talking about. And so people somehow attach wealth with commitment and all those things. But I'm working on a special project now where we're looking at some of the people who crafted education and changed societies. And they were considered, I guess we would say, middle to upper class Blacks. And those were the people who started. And I'm talking about people like Forrest B. Washington, who was the dean or the director at Atlanta University for 27 years, grew up in Boston. And what they meant by that, their families had steady jobs and they were able to educate them well. And so that educated gentry could have, there were a number of them, E. Franklin Frazier, and some people would put W. Du Bois in there because of his educational background. And so I think what we are looking at now, and hopefully some coordination between what people who are famous for doing in art are also looking at the deeper political ramifications of how things are going in society. And so, but not dismiss the academics and other people who are doing thoughtful inquiry into the problems of people of color. And so I think you have to be really careful not to, and I think it's appealing because people who have that status, they can, time they say something, they're going to put them on the news. I think Beyonce has shown some sensitivity, particularly to HBCUs, have given out messages. So we don't want to necessarily discount them, but I also don't want to make them in a separate category. I think LeBron James has done a great job. We need to have a wide range of people that we consider leaders and contributors because we are not a narrow community. We are a broad community. We have a lot to offer. And we can go from the grassroots people like Fannie Lou Hamer all the way up to people who have the resources to build new schools and buildings and all those kinds of things because we need all of them. But I don't want to categorize them. And maybe for young people, it's easier for them to deal with the hip hop stars or athletes because they are more visible, but we need to encourage them to education about how these other people have contributed to our community, made it viable, made changes that go into laws. And so we have to consider all of that. And so if you hear people saying that, help them reframe what they mean. Not discounting that, because some of these people are at a way are in a position to help us financially way better than they were, say, years ago. So I think we just have to be very careful about people like to put Black people in boxes. And so that if we do this one thing over here, that's the only thing we do. No, we're broad. We can do everything.
Yes, yes. And I think you hit on the key. The important thing is education. Many of our celebrities need to understand history. They need to understand current events, the implications of what's going on in society. And we could start a whole nother conversation if we start talking about Lil Wayne and Ice Cube and those athletes who rallied behind our current president, who represents, it seems, everything that they are supposed to be speaking out against. And you have to think of that economic factor from their perspectives in terms of not wanting to pay higher taxes if Biden, well, now since Biden has been elected, but that may have been a motivating factor. I don't know for sure, but it kind of sounds that way. And so that class issue is complicated, complex, Olamide, I'm sorry. And I think, Ruby, you've hit on that complexity. And again, I believe that the key to making sure that we are on the same page, and our celebrities are working in sync with our activists, as some of them are. But the key is to wake them up, make sure they're woke, make sure they know, make sure they're
Comment
yes.
on that too. We were talking about people who have bigger microphones, so they're heard because of that, because of their status. But we have to weigh what they're saying and perhaps analyze why they are saying what they're saying, because famous rich people say stupid things sometimes, and we can't follow them just because they're rich and famous if they're stupid. We need to judge for ourselves if there's merit to what they're saying.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
for me, it was Malcolm X who helped me to think about this for the first time. That the distinction he frequently made between the house slaves and the field slaves had a big impact on me. And it was the African revolutionary Amilcar Cabral who was also very helpful for me in thinking through this. There are people who come from very privileged backgrounds, and the movements can use people, can benefit from people who come from privileged backgrounds. But the question is whether or not those people from privileged backgrounds, are they willing to commit class suicide? Are they willing to commit class suicide, as Cabral put it, is crucial. Someone like a Fidel Castro, who came from an elite, rich background and so on, that's exactly what he did in committing class suicide. And so that makes a big difference for me.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, and I would also think just briefly that when we talk about the house slave versus the field slave, all house slaves are not your enemy. All field slaves are not your friend.
Yes. Yes, for sure.
I would like to say to the statements made, I think that one of the biggest things that looking at it now, you recognize that sometimes we as African Americans, and even I think as people, but specifically in this conversation, we sometimes box ourselves. As you mentioned, we're boxing society to think that if you're a basketball player, you should only be a basketball player and you should shut up and dribble, as many have told LeBron and various athletes. But sometimes even with the situation you gave with Ice Cube and Lil Wayne, now they've reached a certain class level where they're, you know, doing things, trying to get the money that they may need or may want or whatever. And in some senses, they are considered a sellout because at that point, they're boxing themselves to only operate in the fact that I'm in this class, I'm in this money bracket, and I need to keep this. And I think in this time of movement, and we have to be very careful, not to do it to ourselves, but to also, check our individuals when it comes to that time, because the decision is not only made on your behalf for your individual, for your life, for your family, but it's made on the community you're a part of. Like I personally don't think we have the luxury to say like I can make this decision, it only affects me. In reality, like the decision I make, affects everybody. That's how I move when it comes to being a part of Morehouse College. If I go into a new space that maybe they've never heard of that, it's like, okay, now I'm like one of the first ones here, and the college behind me, and it's all support and love. But generally, I do think that's how we should move going forward.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Um, Samyet, any closing words from you, or a final question? I think we will have to close out after this, but any questions that you might have, or reaction to an earlier question that you didn't get a chance to answer?
I don't think I have a specific question at this point in time, but I do want to say that it's important for spaces like this to continue to happen, not only for the benefit of young people who are aspiring to be activists, but for those in the community as well, to be able to come into a space like this and be able to listen and learn and reflect on what you've done in the past and where you want to go in the future is essential for our growth. I think a lot of times, even in like my generation, I can speak for, we're always so on the go and we're ready to do the next thing. We're ready to be something, to do something for our community, but we never take the time to reflect and just listen. I had a conversation with my Afro department yesterday about how they're asking about my intellectual curiosity. And I was like, we don't have time to be curious anymore because we're always doing so much. There's not times to figure out what we really want to learn about. But I think we need to be purposeful to create those times. And like, this is one of these times right now. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I thank you all. This has been a great conversation. And I think it should just be the beginning. I hope that we can stay connected, this group, and really think about establishing mentor-mentee relationships. And, that mentorship can go both ways. I think Charles has always talked about the fact that veterans of the movement can learn some things from our younger activists. And you all have shown, Olamide and Samyet, you have shown that we can indeed learn much from your generation. And it's good to know that you are carrying on. You have picked up the torch and you are doing things in the world and will do things perhaps that we hadn't even thought about in terms of how to ensure that social justice is that the fight for social justice continues and doing it in venues that we hadn't even thought about. We didn't even have a chance to go into the impact of your heritage, the fact that your family originally from the continent, both of you from Nigerian families originally, and how that you may personally feel that has impacted you and your activism and the way you move through the world. I think it's so important and so good to know that we have diversity within our community, within our Black community. And it's so important to utilize all those aspects of diversity as we move forward collectively to become catalysts for social change and social justice. So I thank each and every one of you. And I'm going to let Melinda take over from now and tell us how we and others can access the recording, access other pieces of information about the other workshops that have occurred over the course of the fall. But thank you all, to all of our panelists.
Yes, I want to thank our moderator, and I want to thank all of our panelists for such a wonderful conversation today. And I want to remind our audience that you can find all of the work that we've done, our teach-ins, and all of the fall workshops are available on our YouTube channel. And I think, Hyder, if you could put that in the chat. You can also access For each of our workshops, we always have a presence on our Google site that highlights the work of the panelists and gives you a view from each of our cities around all of the issues that we have covered and examined this fall and over the summer. Thank you all. This was a great conversation, and everybody be well and take care.
It's a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
All right.
Goodbye.